Greetings, fellow floofs. My name, for all intents and purposes here, is Charlotte, and I welcome you to my YouTube channel. Last week's books were a little bit all over the place, but I would say I still had a good time. There was some light, almost fairy tale-like fantasy. There was some Sanderson fantasy, which at this point is kind of its own genre to me, and also some books about women and trauma and horror and some other stuff, which I'll get into now. So let's go. The book that I finished at the beginning of the week was Set the Dead. Now, this one took me a while, and not even because of the length. Mostly it's just because it is not the type of book that I can read in like one breath, you know? I selected it sort of on a whim from the library because it has just been added to the collection, and I sort of religiously check new editions, so I noticed it. It being a very new book, there weren't really any reviews for it, but the author seemed to be in very high regard, so I decided to try it. The author being Irish is also why I will not try and pronounce their name and last name. I know when I'm outmatched. So basically, I saw the cover of the book and was like, okay, this looks like something worth reading. I really just judged the book by its cover. And I stand by that. That is the damn good cover. And in hindsight, I would actually say that it conveys the feelings of the book pretty well. It matches very nicely. So good job. It did take me a while to get through it, though, as I said. Said the dead. Said the undead. Said the alive. The story is slow, and I would even say almost non existent. And in theory, time is passing and we are learning things, but it's almost hypnotic at a certain point. We're just moving in circles and not really going forward. I guess that is why I pretty much fell asleep a couple times while reading somewhere like the first half of the book when I was still sort of waiting for an inciting incident to happen and it just never materialized. I think I sort of misunderstood the genre when I read ghost story in the description because, well, you can certainly say that there were some ghosts there. It was definitely not in the least spooky, more like sad and melancholic. And those are not necessarily the emotions that I welcome in my reading material, so maybe you can understand why it took me a while to get through it. It was written impeccably, though, I'll give them that. The emotions were there. I just prefer not to feel them. But because of the nature of the book and its story, I at least feel more comfortable explaining most of the plot because it's not really something that can be spoiled necessarily. On the contrary, I feel like if I had known better what to expect, I would have enjoyed it more. So throughout this book, we follow a woman, described mainly as the reader, as she comes in the evenings to a sort of a psychiatrist to tell what's been bothering her. So, as she explains it, for years now, she has been obsessed with a certain historical topic, and she just can't let go of it. The psychiatrist makes notes while she's talking and hopes that through this process of storytelling, she will be able to put an end to her obsession. She starts with telling us that near the city of Cork in Ireland, there used to be a mental hospital, which started operating somewhere in the Victorian times and finally closed its doors somewhere pretty much at the end of the 20th century. A separate wing of the structure was dedicated to female patients, of whom there were many, 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 with many different ailments, real or imagined. The trigger for the woman to start her obsession about what happened at that place. I've been watching too many Criminal Minds. It's all about triggers and stressors. Was the discovery that soon the buildings will be converted to apartments, leaving the outer structures but replacing everything within. Well, she starts coming by. First, she pretends to be an interested buyer, and then she just sort of starts sneaking onto the property and snooping around the buildings. She also keeps seeing signs, as in, she'll see some colorful broken glass on the ground and think that it's there for her, or she'll see a metal rod in the shape of an L and think that this is a message for her, that sort of stuff. And she herself fully acknowledges that if the times were different, most likely she would have had to spend some time in the mental institution herself, and implies that she has gone through multiple suicide attempts in the past. Even though she has a pretty active family life, we don't actually learn anything substantial about her husband or her children. No names, no personalities, nothing. The real kickoff to most of the story happens when she realizes that the local archive will actually have all the documents from the mental institution, and she might actually be able to get at them. Stuff like case books with patient records and doctor's notes. She succeeds at that, even though she's not necessarily welcome at the archive because she's not a journalist or a researcher or a doctor. But she has a limit though, because she is only allowed to get at documents that are over 100 years old. So she knows that her research is going to have to stop somewhere in the 1920s. The reader becomes particularly entranced by the work and life of one of the first female doctors, Lucia Strangman. She documented and treated hundreds of female patients, and we learn about so many of them from the casebooks. The mysticism and ghostly aspects of the book come mainly through the way in which we are told this information. Most of the time, while the reader is going through these casebooks, not that much is actually written in them, and yet the account that she gives to us and the psychiatrist are really vivid with detail about tragedy and suffering, healing, sometimes joy. She tells these stories as if she's standing right there in the past, as if she's watching it all transpire, watching these women get admitted, go through or refuse treatment, sometimes heal and sometimes die. And then there are even more surreal moments to the story where she really seems to believe that the people from the stories and the case books actually see her, feel her through the fabric of time, sense her presence, and fear her as the ghost haunting the asylum. Good stuff. Once she zeroes in on Lucia, the reader basically just follows her life story. Her childhood and early family life. She even finds some photos of her and her sister from those times. Her studies and employment at the asylum. And then even her eventual marriage to a doctor there and the arrival of her children. Later in life, Lucia opens a sort of outpatient clinic where she and her husband devise methods to prevent psychiatric problems through the method of questions, answers, and storytelling. And this is the moment in the story where you kind of start to suspect that maybe the psychiatrist that the reader has been talking to actually has a connection to Lucia, or something like that. The ending is sort of ambiguous, which is not necessarily my favorite type of ending, but I would say that it serves the book pretty well. Big chunks of the book focus on telling the stories of the female patients, which also kind of gets really repetitive, especially after you meet like the third Kate or fifth Margaret. The writing also served to provide quite a bit of the repetitiveness. At times, it felt very much like a poem in prose form, very sing-songy. As not a very huge fan of poetry, understatement of the year. I'm not a big fan of this type of writing as well, so it was a bit hard for me to stay engaged. But the book itself felt very well researched, and you could tell that the author spent a crazy amount of time in historical archives pouring through material like this. I also got to learn some new information about the history of Ireland and its fight for independence, which was kind of added here and there as the backdrop for some of the women's life stories. We meet some historical figures significant to the time and place when the asylum operated, like Terence McSweeney and his wife Muriel. I love it when books like this include real people from history. I had the same experience with The Reformatory. I don't have much to say in terms of deep analysis of the book, but I am really glad that I read it. This is one of those times where if this book had been recommended to me, I would kind of be greatly confused because it is truly really far outside of my comfort zone. But because I stumbled upon it myself, I sort of appreciated it much more. 7 out of 10. In the end, it was a worthwhile experience, even though I do not wish to repeat it anytime soon. It was a thoughtful, haunting, and beautiful book that maybe could have used some actual ghosts. Now we hard shift into some fantasy, fairy tales, and some actual magic. Seeing as Nettle and Bone is actually one of T.Kingfisher's earliest books, it is a bit surprising that it took me a while to stumble upon it at my library, but recently when I saw it available, I snatched it up real quick. Lately, I'm getting lucky with getting her books from the library because right now I'm actually finishing up reading Wolfworm, which I will be discussing in next week's video. As for Nettle and Bone, I am really happy that I finally got to read it, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, but it still isn't beating out What Moves the Dead for me. Short description of the premise because I don't want to spoil this one too much. We follow Mara, who is the third daughter of a king and queen of a small kingdom that is kind of stuck between two large powers. She grows up loving and adoring her oldest sister, kind of dealing more or less with her middle sister, and being mostly ignored and neglected by her parents. Through a series of unfortunate events, Mara, at the age of like 15, is sent to a convent so that she doesn't threaten the succession of the northern neighboring kingdom, whose heir apparent prince is now married to her middle sister Kanya. In theory, as soon as the son is born to the royal couple, Mara should be able to marry, but time goes by, pregnancy is hard, and Kanya is sort of unable to produce a suitable inheritor for the throne. So Mara stays at the convent, helping the nuns, learning some intricate embroidery and stitching, And over time, she even starts helping the local delivery woman with the births in the area. Obviously, her interest is coming from the fact that her own sister is having such a hard time with her pregnancies. And by years go by, I mean, Mara is actually like 30 at the beginning of the book. She literally spent over half her life at the convent. And she doesn't even really begrudge this fact because living at court usually meant being open to manipulation, intrigue, scheming, and just generally being used as a pawn. Unfortunately, after visiting her sister once at the palace, Mara learns some very unsettling news, and after taking some time, like literally months, to come to terms with the fact that no help will actually be coming from anywhere, she sets out on her own adventure to be of assistance. There, I was as vague as possible. I feel like it actually hurts not to tell every single detail of the story. So, knowing that she can't actually accomplish much on her own, Mara sets off to kind of gather a merry band of companions to help her in her quest, even though some of those companions are not really planned for from the beginning. Along her travels, she gathers a grave witch or dust witch, who, apropos, has a chicken possessed by a demon. Why not? A brave warrior who I saw appear and instantly was like, ding ding ding, love interest alert, love interest alert. And a fairy godmother who is not necessarily very skilled at providing blessings. I guess it is obvious now why the story gave off such strong fairy tale vibes. We have a princess in danger, an old witch, a fairy godmother, and a rescue mission. The vibe was very similar to Hemlock and Silver, but that main heroine was kind of a little bit more proficient in matters of the outside world. In Nettle and Bone, however, I did feel that even though the main character was over 30 years old, she was a little bit too naive about the world and people in general. Some things in her environment were so obvious, and yet it took her way too long to acknowledge them and come to terms with them, even stuff that was very plain to see. I noticed that in a lot of T.Kingfisher's books, that kind of tends to be the case. Characters just shaking their heads and refusing to accept reality as it really is. So far, the worst example of that would be What Feasts at Night, but I can already tell that Wolfworm is probably gonna top even that. I don't appreciate characters being very slow to catch on to very obvious facts. It always feels as if they've been living their life pretending to be an emu, just head in the sand, and that's it. So that got a little bit on my nerves in this story. Although once the situation finally sunk in, Mara was more than willing to do anything in anyone's power to help those in need. I really liked that. And while she herself was not exactly the most skilled at pretty much anything other than embroidery, she did do her best to actually achieve her goal, which is my way of saying that the story has a happy ending. You'd think that's a given, but just you wait. Just you wait to see what's coming. Overall, I give this book an 8 out of 10 because even though that one denial aspect really bugged me, the story still progressed at a pretty good pace and the characters were really fun and engaging. I think I could tell that this book was one of her earlier ones, but it already had her style and her flair, so happy to have read it. And now we have the master of fantasy, Mr. Brandon Sanderson himself. It's kind of funny because after I read Tress of the Emerald Sea, I decided to read all the Secret Project books in order. So the second one would have been the Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. But for some reason, as soon as I saw Isles of the Emberdark in my Skip the Line tab on Libby, I just kind of forgot all about that plan. I don't know what came over me. I first grabbed it as an audiobook, but didn't actually start listening to it right away because I had long walking plans for a couple days later, so I thought the audiobook would work great for that. But then a couple days later, I literally saw the same book, but this time as a reading book. And I mean, first it didn't really matter to me because I already had it as an audiobook. But then I remembered that some people like to listen to audiobooks while they are reading the physical version of the same book, and I just got really intrigued, like, why do people do that? And how would that actually change my reading experience? So I grabbed the ebook and got to work. The book was basically now part of an experiment. And I have to say, the results of the experiment are in, and they are not great. I think I do understand why some people prefer to listen to audiobooks only if they can read along with the physical version of the book, because it focuses you so much more on the story and allows a lot less distractions and more vivid imaginings. But it also takes so much longer. I would have read the book in like 7 hours, and in the end, it took me more than 10 with the audiobook sent to like 175 speed. I guess I just don't have the patience for it. Maybe if the story was less exciting, I would have been more fine going slowly. But after a certain point, you just want to know what happens as soon as possible. And if you're constrained to the speed of someone reading to you can't really go as fast as possible as you would with just a printed book. Well, tangent aside, I am pretty happy that I managed to grab this book pretty much as soon as my library added it to its collection. Now to the story. Just like with Nettle and Bone, I won't go into too much detail. I would recommend for you to just go and read the book yourself. It is a nice standalone story about staying true to yourself, believing in yourself, and finding use for your extreme survival skills, I guess. There has to be a different message there as well, but the main character did succeed in the end mainly because he trusted in his hard earned survival skills. So there's that. I like these secret project books from Sanderson. They do not require any prior knowledge of the universe or recurring characters. Since prior I had only read Tress, I did recognize a couple of the characters in this book, but even if I hadn't, it wouldn't have made much of a difference because it really wasn't that important to the story. And so we mainly follow two characters: a man from a planet that sort of resembles Earth called the Sixth of Dusk, or just Dusk, and a basically sort of dragonborn girl called Illistandrista, or as she calls herself, Starling. She is about 80 years old by her racist standards, but mentally she is more like in her mid 20s, which is typical for their kind. We start the story with the main characters being basically in different galaxies, and then over time and curious circumstances, they end up in the same place, even though they have very different goals. Dusk is basically trying to save his whole planet. We learned that a couple years ago, alien races showed up at the planet and are now kind of putting pressure on the population to submit to them. And because Dusk's planet is very far behind technologically, they know that they aren't really in a strong negotiating position. So far, they are only safe because of like intergalactic courtesies, where straight up attacking them and subjugating them would be unseemly. So the aliens, and I'm using this term very loosely, are now trying to kind of curry favor with the population and put them under their thumb through modern technologies and dependency on them. Dusk, however, comes from the old way of life. He was raised to be a trapper, a person who is trained to survive on incredibly dangerous small islands outside of the mainland where incredibly dangerous plants and creatures live. There is, however, a reason for why people of his profession were needed in the past, although now they are kind of becoming obsolete in this modern world. You might say that Dusk is setting on the old way of life. That is no joke, it is actually why he was named Dusk. Since he is unwilling to just sit around and watch as his civilization is taken over and diminished, Dusk decides to embark on an incredibly dangerous and pretty much suicidal mission to prove that his people can hold their own against very advanced civilizations. At the same time, Starling's story is a bit more connected to the outer cosmos because since she comes from this ancient civilization, obviously they have long ago started interacting with others throughout the galaxies. But on the other hand, her story is a bit more contained because her main goal is just to keep her crew and her ship together and alive. They kind of feel like the crew from the Rocinant from the Expanse book series, all very talented, but outcasts and misfits who don't really have anywhere else to go. And so Starling does her best to navigate conflicts between intergalactic forces without negative consequences for her crew. That was probably a bit much in terms of plot description, but I really enjoyed the story and the different characters, so I'm just very excited to talk about it. It is interesting, though, that this book was basically developed from a short story that Sanderson wrote years ago about the Sixth of Dusk. When writing for the Secret Project books, Sanderson had an idea on how to expand and continue that story, but he didn't really know whether to rewrite it into the book or leave it out. And so in the end, he decided to include pretty much the whole short story as flashbacks into the first part of the book, explaining Dusk's backstory and his profession as a trapper pretty extensively. I would say that for the most part, it was pretty well integrated into the new story, even though at times it did feel a little bit drawn out and repetitive, which I guess would have been hard to avoid. In the end, though, the book had an incredibly satisfying conclusion, and I really hope that I'll get to meet the main characters in other books that take place in the world of Cosmere. I guess this would be a 10 out of 10. Great story, really fun, and or determined characters, and surprisingly thoughtful themes. I especially like the continuous reminders throughout the story to not underestimate the less technologically advanced civilizations, because them not knowing what electricity is in no way means that they are primitive or unable of incredible deeds and achievements. All in all, just a really, really good book, and I'm so happy that I decided to break my previous plan and read it as soon as I saw it. After this, I read Morsel by Keane. I got this from the library kind of on a whim, not really knowing anything about the book or the author, but the cover art really reminded me of the Sworn Soldier series from T.Kingfisher, so I was kind of hoping for a similar vibe, I guess. And it was not exactly that, but I would say it was still a pretty decent story. It was also pretty short, another similarity with What Moves the Dead, so I read it pretty much in just one afternoon. The title is inspired by the main character, Lou, a woman in her 20s, feeling like the world keeps chipping off pieces from her, demanding more and more over time. Her teachers, her co-workers, her boss, even her mother, who seems to love her very much, but still really burdens her with her hopes and expectations. And Lou herself describes this feeling as having bites taken out of her, morsels of her being eaten over and over, and at the same time, she herself feels empty and hungry and cold. Feels like there's a pretty good supernatural setup there, doesn't it? And there kind of is, but I would still say that the lore is pretty underdeveloped. It's one of those prosperity will come if a sacrifice is made, and there's no real explanation of how exactly that prosperity will be achieved. So, it's a little bit unclear. Or it is, as the main character says, and prosperity is actually achieved through generational wealth, and that's how you reach success instead of the once in a many years sacrifice. It might seem like I'm giving away too much of the story, but I would say that after a certain moments when some things start to go wrong, you kind of already know where the story is going to go. Our main character is having problems focusing on her job because of some pretty serious family issues that are happening. So her boss gives her a different assignment. She's going to have to drive around to remote properties around the area that her company is supposed to be assessing and take notes and photos. So, what could possibly go wrong? Her friend is pretty sure she's gonna get serial killed, and I was so delighted to hear that because after watching Criminal Minds like 4 times each episode, I think this is the first time I actually heard the word serial killed being used as a verb. So Lou grabs her dog and drives to the very remote woods where houses are rare and isolated to look at this property. So she sees some creepy stuff and runs back to the car where she discovers that there's now a hole drilled in the gas tank in her car and she actually can't drive away. Yay! She also discovers that there's suddenly no reception and her phone is bugging. Well, I guess it's time to die, right? I mean, if somebody drains your car of gas in this remote location on purpose, you're pretty much toast. The only question is, do they want to play around with you for a little bit, or do they just want to grab you as soon as possible? I will say, the actions that the main character took did not make me hate everything on this planet. So there's that. Oftentimes in these kinds of stories, the main character will not do or forget to do the most basic and logical actions of them all, like using your cell phone to call your friend and not just the usually unhelpful police or 911, or not checking if somebody's actually dead and then getting ambushed by them later. None of that is here, I'm happy to report. Although there was a scene or two where shooting before asking questions would have been preferable, but I guess at that point she wasn't fully in survival mode yet. I mentioned the dog, and there's actually a disclaimer at the beginning of the book saying that don't worry, the dog makes it out alive. And I mean, strictly speaking, that is not fully the truth, but from the emotional standpoint, I would say that the dog makes it out okay. Lou also makes it out okay, although her quality of life will now be a little bit different. Overall, I pretty much felt annoyed, mostly just at the beginning of the book. There is this scene that just felt so icky to me, I still can't get over it. At the meeting with her boss, Lou just keeps telling us how incredibly attracted she is to him. And he's in his 40s, so obviously he's not that old, but it's just so disgusting from the power dynamic point of view. It did not seem in any way reciprocated. These were just her thoughts and wishes. But reading for the fifth time in 2 pages how she really wishes she could grab his hair from across the table, or how a couple days ago in the elevator with him she thought how it would feel like to rub herself against him, was just probably the most horrifying part of the whole book to me. It just made me so uncomfortable when some extra information got revealed later on in the book. I was just thinking to myself, yeah, you get what you deserve. Maybe think with your brain, not your hormones. I don't know, maybe I'm the odd woman out here, but I just kind of can't imagine being so horny for somebody who you don't even like as a person. Yikes. Oof. So yeah, that kind of bugged me. But otherwise, I would give the book a 7 out of 10. The story was short and moved pretty fast, which I appreciated, and the main character didn't make too many dumb decisions, which was a welcome surprise, and the horror aspect of the story was appropriately creepy and unsettling. I took off points for her weird obsession with her boss and for the story being a little bit too obvious at times. But I guess for a book of this length, it would have been a bit difficult to keep the mystery going for too long. And now we finally arrive at Tradwife. And I would like to express my condolences to everybody who read the book. Don't get me wrong, it is not a bad one by any means. The premise is quite new, and this connection to the weird modern phenomenon of becoming a tradwife is pretty timely. But I felt such frustration at large chunks of the book that I literally was sad that I don't have a physical copy of the book to throw at a wall. Not that I would necessarily. I do treat my books with care, but I mean, I can always imagine that that is what I would have done, right? So, Treadwife follows the story of a 30-year-old journalist from New York City, Jenny Kaplan, who reminds us that, in case we forgot to notice in the last 10 years, journalism is a dying art, jobs are scarce, and good writing that can touch people's souls is very rare. Feeling very unsatisfied with her job, Jenny writes a very biographical article that is full of really personal information and many traumatizing things that have happened to her. The piece is published and goes viral, but over time, she actually starts being harassed because of it. To establish herself more as a serious journalist and also to kind of bury herself in her work, Jenny accepts the assignment to do an interview with one of the most popular treadwives on YouTube, Mia Wright. The woman lives on a farm, has a husband, 7 kids, and is pregnant again, and also runs a business and her YouTube channel where she sells stuff that they make on the farm through a very sketchy MLM. The interview goes about as well as Jenny would have expected. Mia is charming, but also kind of phony. But at the end of the interview, she really begs Jenny to come and stay with them for a week, live a while in her shoes, so to speak, and learn more about her and her lifestyle. Unfortunately, Jenny doesn't realize that she's in a psychological horror book, and so she accepts the offer. Now, this book actually made me mad a couple of times and for a couple of different reasons. Some of them justified, some of them not. I mean, after all, it isn't the book's fault that I really want for the conflict to end in a positive way for my main character, for the evil to be defeated, even if it's just for now, and for there to be more or less a happily ever after. Because let me tell you, that is not nearly what you're gonna get at the end of this. And even though this is kind of a spoiler, I sort of wish that somebody would have warned me about it, because then I wouldn't have spent my time reading the book and thinking, okay, now it's gonna work out. Now this is gonna be okay. Yeah, I would have preferred the soul crushing to happen in advance. Another aspect of the book that annoyed me to the point of book throwing was just the complacency of the main character. I mean, she's acting as an investigative journalist, for crying out loud, and yet she's so passive and so willing to accept everything that's happening around her. It's just mind boggling. Her hair keeps falling out, her stuff is going missing, and yet she just keeps staying at Mia's house, eating what she cooks, and sleeping in the guest room, where the door is unlocked in the morning, where she definitely locked it in the evenings. Thing is, I get that certain things need to happen to her for the plot to work. But, like, the least the author could have done was given us a plausible explanation for why no alternatives were available. Like, maybe she tries to move out, and there are no rooms at the inn in town. Or maybe she confronts Mia over her stolen face creams and toothpaste, and Mia is like, oh no, I'm so sorry, my children got to them, and we will of course reimburse you for everything, but for now you have to start using our stuff. Like, give me something. Don't make your character, the journalist, such a doormat. And I guess that could be part of the point. The point is that Jenny's going through her life too scared to rock the boat, too nervous to confront anybody. Her patronizing younger sister, her mentally unstable ex boyfriend, her mediocre boss. But if that's the case, that makes it even more difficult to root for your main character to escape. You start thinking, well, she brought it on herself. She shouldn't have been walking around alone, so passive and meek. Do you feel the analogy? So I prefer to blame the writer. I think it was still very possible to convey how unsure about her life Jenny was, and how unwilling she was to burden anybody else with her issues without making her a complete disappointment. And when it comes to the ending, it was so bleak. There was absolutely no bright side. You just feel wrung out and just want it to be over. And because of what you read at a couple points of the book, you feel like the message was, see, she waited too long to dig herself out of that hole, and now her whole life is ruined. Which works out to be a terrible message, that there's only a certain point in your life up until which you can improve stuff, and then it's just all downhill from there. So bleak, that is not why I read fiction books, okay? Jeez. Of course, the other way to interpret the ending is that in modern society, women can only achieve a certain amount. And if they want even that, they have to basically fully agree to be servants to others and fully subjugate themselves, at least for a certain period of time. And I guess this could be perceived as true to a certain extent, but with how bleak and uncompromisingly awful the ending was, portraying this as a necessary stepping stone to future success without a way out was just kind of horrific. There is no hint that things will be better in the future, no sign of improvement, and on the contrary, it's shown that this tradwife thing is actually taking over the world. Also, there was this terribly uncomfortable implication that a big reason why Jenny decided to endure a lot of the stuff that was happening to her was because she felt sorry for the children of the house. She basically decided that there needs to be somebody who has to take care of them. And so she took over those responsibilities, basically just like she did in her childhood when she had to take care of her and her younger sister. But as I said, all of this leads to disastrous consequences, not just for Jenny, but for the whole world. So, what exactly is it trying to say? That women can be easily manipulated through children? It's basically saying, yeah, unless you can be a uncaring and detached person who doesn't want to help others, then you will be taken advantage of and suffer greatly with no upsides. Good message. Thanks. I guess the author wanted this to be a cautionary tale, kind of what happens when we get complacent. But if that's the case, I feel like the main heroine should have been more of an anti hero and not a tragic heroine. I don't know. Something just really didn't work for me in this story, but I would love to hear other people's opinion on this one. I will give it a 5 out of 10. I started out this recap thinking 7 out of 10, and then I just got angrier and angrier. And at this point, I'm unhappy that I even have to give it a 5. Maybe it deserves more for being so topical and mostly engaging overall, but there were certain points in the book that were so difficult for me to get through that I can't bring myself to give it a higher score. So that's that. Now, with the book reviews done, let's do the movie review. Since I figured that this week's book review is going to take quite a while to discuss, I thought that for the movie review, I'm going to give a quick overview and my thoughts on two movies that I saw basically as a double feature week before last. That means that I'm leaving last week's disclosure day for next week because that one will take quite a while to cover and I have a lot of thoughts there and they're not exactly positive. First, we have Good Boy. I didn't even see a trailer for this one prior to the screenings, and I mean, I go to the cinema a lot, so I see pretty much all the trailers. But about this one, I learned just from the monthly booklet that my cinema chain releases. And even there was just like a short description and the poster, but like, what a poster it was, right? I mean, need I say more? Right off the bat, you kind of know that you're in for a weird movie, and you just kind of hope that they will manage to pull it off. And I truly think they did. Now, there is another movie called Good Boy that was released a couple months ago in 2025, and that one is actually about a dog. Because of this, I think this movie's alternative title is Heel, which, I mean, I have to say is still a very much dog related title, so I don't know how helpful this distinction is. In the end, on Wikipedia, the distinction is made through the director, Jan Komasa. A Polish producer gave him the script to adapt in like 2019, and the story was supposed to originally be set in Poland, but it was ultimately moved to Yorkshire in the UK. And believe me, if you didn't know that the movie was made by a Polish team before you went to see it, you will definitely figure it out after it starts because you know those opening credits that tell you like the production company and some other funding agencies that contributed and stuff like that. Well, it felt like every single organization in Poland contributed to the making of this movie. It felt like there were at least 20 of them. Pretty sure there were even more. I'm usually a somewhat expressive watcher, not disruptive, but like I will laugh if a joke is funny or yelp if I get really jump scared. So after like the 10th logo appeared, I couldn't hold in a giggle. It was truly funny. And I kid you not, even the people in my row, after another like 5 logos appeared, even they started laughing. It was truly like a comedy sketch. Nothing in the movie had started yet, and we were already in the mood for a dark comedy. So finally, the movie starts. The opening sequence is truly top notch. We follow a night out on the town with Tommy, who's just the most disgusting little shit you could ever imagine. He yells, drinks, does drugs, beats people up for the fun of it, cheats on his situationship or kind of girlfriend, it's not quite clear, and it's just the most antisocial and violent idiot. He gets really drunk and wanders off away from his friends into a different street, and then the footage cuts to black. It's mysterious. We move away to the perspective of an immigrant woman named Rena who's interviewing for a housekeeping position with a man named Chris. She gets the job, and when she comes to his remote house in the English countryside, she is relieved of all her electronics and then given a house tour where she meets his wife, Catherine, who is kind of suffering from depression, presumably, and their 10-year-old son, Jonathan. While the house tour started off a little bit creepy, she gets more comfortable being in this faraway house with people that she doesn't know, and then Chris leads her down to show her the basement. You kind of tense up because nothing good ever happens in a basement, and then Chris shows her the room at the bottom of the stairs where Tommy is sleeping on a mattress chained to the ceiling. Obviously, she tries to run, but Chris tells her that this is for his own good and they're only trying to help him. And, anyways, doesn't she have some trouble with the law and immigration? And does she really want to get mixed up in this? So, in the end, Rena does some cleaning and agrees to come by twice a week for the job. It was such a good intro, surprising, fun, really tense. You get this feeling of incredulity like, do they really think that they can straight up kidnap a young guy, chain him up in their basement, and then even show him to another person and still get away with it? And it actually works, partially because Tommy's just such a shithead that you feel like chaining him up yourself. He yells at everybody, including Rena, who would be his best chance of getting out. He belittles her as an immigrant, and it's just straight up so nasty that it really is no wonder that she doesn't feel like helping him. The black comedy aspect of the movie also comes from the fact that Chris is like so soft spoken. He actually tells Rena, don't take to heart anything that Tommy might say in a state of stress. Like it is just a stressful situation being chained up in a basement. Tommy's just going through a rebellious phase. I tell you, Stephen Graham, who plays Chris, was incredible in this movie. I mean, all the actors did a really, really good job, but at this moment, I just want to highlight how like non-threatening he comes off, even though obviously he has all the power and control in the situation. And even later on, there are scenes where he becomes violent, but he still manages to like control himself, which makes it come off even scarier. So over the course of the next few weeks, Chris and his family try to rehabilitate Tommy. So he detoxes, they play him classical music, and they make him watch PSAs about like dangers of drunk driving and taking drugs. And the PSAs were filmed by Chris and Jonathan, and they look like they're from the 90s, just so grainy and old. Stay away from cocaine. Words to live by, I suppose. But after a particularly mean moment that Tommy had with Catherine, Chris really beats him up with a baton, and that scene was kind of hard to watch. Over time, though, Tommy either comes to terms with his situation, or what I think is more likely, he just decides to pretend to be nicer.
I would like to apologize for what I did to you. I promise not to do it again. Good boy.
Catherine gives him books to read, and it seems like he actually starts enjoying them. And also, Catherine figures out that he has trouble with his vision, so she finds him a pair of glasses, and he's truly shocked at how much better he can see. When the family starts showing him clips of his like past escapades that he posted online, first he really enjoys seeing himself as a fucking movie star. My accent's perfect. But like, hats off to the actor. My God. Anson Boone, great job. I'm sure you're a lovely person, but you make it so easy to hate Tommy. Thank you. But over time, it actually becomes hard for him to see it in the same way, especially after he has glasses and sees the look of like sadness and pain on Catherine's face. So after the family becomes more accustomed to him, and especially Jonathan starts seeing him as a friend, they decide to celebrate Tommy's birthday by chloroforming him and taking him out for a picnic outside in the nature somewhere in the vast hills of England. It really seems like this is the first time in Tommy's life that he's experiencing something like this, and he seems really moved by the gesture. Again, it's just the juxtaposition between the feeling and the reality of the situation, because obviously he is being held captive by this family, but he's also being shown more kindness and attention than he has ever received in his life. Just great writing, such a good story. When they come back home and Tommy recovers from the chloroform, Tommy discovers that they have actually moved him into a room upstairs and that now he has his own bedroom and bathroom. He also sees that there's a name Charlie scratched into a table, but when he tries to find out who that is, nobody really wants to talk about it. The chains, of course, were also moved with him, but they're longer now, and they're connected to this ceiling mounted track system that allows him to like pull the chain in different directions so that he can actually cover a larger area. He can also now move the chain from the upstairs to the downstairs where the kitchen and the living room are, but there's still a limitation there because on the stairs there's this combination lock where somebody has to put in a code if they want him to switch from the tracks upstairs to the track downstairs so that he doesn't have unlimited access in the house and he still can't stay there unsupervised. They do say that he can now run around the house, and he demonstrates that with great enthusiasm, kind of like an actual dog would. It's kind of creepy. As a side story, Rena tells the family that she's being followed, and as the good Samaritans that they are, they offer for her to stay with them for a while. There's this lovely scene where Jonathan, Tommy, and Rena help Chris arrange kind of like a romantic dinner date for Catherine to reconnect with her. And you really start to notice the difference between how she is now and how she was at the beginning of the movie. So depressed and sullen and emotionally distant. While this celebration is happening, Tommy manages to hide a knife in a flower pot. We are shown a conversation between Catherine and Tommy, and while discussing books, Catherine posits the question of whether it is better to live in a blissful stupor or to come out into heartless reality. And presumably by now, Tommy understands that his prior life of drugs, drinking, and debauchery was the blissful stupor, and that now that he is sober and living honestly somewhat, that would be a reality. We're getting close to the end. So, sometime later, while Chris is gone, gang members break into the house and announce that they are taking Rena with them. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but I guess Rena is related to one of them, and so they now want her back. No happy ending for Rena, I guess. There's a scuffle, and Tommy gets beaten up a little bit, though nobody comments on the fact that he's actually chained to the ceiling. Rena manages to tell him the code to the combination lock in secret, and then she's taken away. Later on, when Chris comes home, he actually praises Tommy for defending their family. Delusional, man, delusional. And tells him that next day he's going to install a bunch of cameras and motion sensors and alarms. So Tommy knows that if he wants to escape, it's now or never. In the night, he uses the stack of books that he got from Catherine to reach the combination lock and let himself downstairs. And then he uses the knife that he hid in the flower pot to break the collar around his neck. Oh, yeah, did I not mention that? Of course, the chain is connected to a collar around his neck. And I have to say, I was truly surprised that he didn't break his neck like 5 times over, the way he was throwing and contorting himself, especially at the beginning of the movie. Chris and Catherine obviously hear the commotion and come downstairs, and Chris actually brings a gun, but Tommy is already free and he ambushes them and takes the gun. He demands to go free and states that he is not Charlie, whoever that may have been and whatever they may have done to him. To us, it is pretty clear that Charlie was their older son, probably about Tommy's age, who also probably had similar behavioral issues as Tommy, but because the family didn't intervene or did it too late, Charlie either ran away or he died. It really is that ambiguous. We really don't know. And I've seen different interpretations of this, saying maybe Charlie didn't even exist. Maybe Tommy is Charlie, but with like a split personality situation. Or maybe Charlie was their previous prisoner that they also tried to rehabilitate but failed. But I really don't think that that was the intention of the filmmakers. I think this is really a story about grief that the family experiences because one of their members is gone, and now they attempt to replace him with somebody else, also trying to get this rehabilitation process done right this time. In the end, Chris agrees that it is time to let Tommy go. Catherine is really distraught and grabs the gun and actually tries to shoot herself, but the gun turns out wasn't loaded, and so Tommy just escapes. We see him wander down the road, and later we see him in a hospital. Tommy doesn't even admit to anybody that he was kidnapped. Instead, he says that he just decided to leave his life for a while and go traveling with his buddy Jonathan. You truly can tell that he really had a connection with the kid. It's kind of heartbreaking. He goes home and realizes that it wasn't even his mother who reported him missing. It was his girlfriend that we saw in the beginning, Gabby. We see how empty and shallow his family life is, if you can even call it that. His mother ignores him. He doesn't actually have real friends. And once he sees Gabby in a nightclub, she is also now drinking and doing drugs, just like he did in the beginning. She tells him that she wants to disappear. I'm pretty sure she means it in a metaphorical sense, but she realizes how empty her life is, just like his was in the beginning. So the next morning, he drives her in a car into nature to hills similar to those where he and the family celebrated his birthday. He chloroforms her, carries her out of the car, and then sets the car on fire. I really didn't see it coming. Afterwards, he carries Gabby to the front gate of the house where the family lives and rings the bell. The next 10 to 15 seconds are kind of excruciating because you kind of imagine that maybe the family moved or maybe they are just not allowing him in. But then the light goes on at the end of the driveway and the whole family steps outside to welcome him and Gabby. The end. That ending, I mean, ha, wow. I think it would be really easy to push this off onto like Stockholm Syndrome or something. But I think if you take the a little bit more charitable interpretation, it's just that Tommy saw what a loving family life could actually look like, and he didn't want to settle for the kind of subpar option that he would have had in his real life. At this point, you could kind of say that his blissful stupor would be living with the family and presumably Gabby instead of living with his actual mom. Bringing Gabby was such a surprise, but I guess he understood how difficult it would have been to help her without her really understanding how much help she really needs, just like he did. And so he decided that what he experienced was actually not such a bad idea. I really came out of the movie thinking that this film is great fun for those who never really had traumatic stuff happen to them, but otherwise, a lot of the stuff here could be really triggering. Thankfully, I belong in the former category, so I had a blast, and at least from my limited personal experience, I really appreciated the takes on rehabilitation, family relationships, however forced, and accepting a found family instead of your real one. As I said, we can't really paint the family as saviors or even morally upright people because they are controlling, like Chris, or emotionally broken, like Catherine, or just in need of connection, like Jonathan. But at the end of the day, they are just kind of trying to keep it together and do the best that they can, sort of. I really enjoyed this movie. Can't even really think of any plot holes to complain about. Maybe only just the fact that the mob didn't even seem to question why there was a guy with a chain holding him. But I mean, it's the mob. Maybe they see stuff like that on the daily. In the end, I think I need to give it a 9 out of 10. I took off 1 point for a very touchy subject being handled as a black comedy, just like I would have done for the drama a couple months ago. But I do think that this movie would be a lot more palatable for the general audience. I, on the other hand, had a blast and was incredibly happy to have gone. It gave me some stuff to think about and provided some really great laughs. And now, the second movie, Mother Mary. I saw it right after Good Boy. Well, that was different. Just kidding. Kinda. I mean, I will not go into a deep analysis for this one. It was beautiful, and I did enjoy it, but it was also so confusing that I think I sat through half the movie with this face. A lot of the dialogue was so abstract and metaphorical that it was almost annoying to follow, though I did like this exchange. I will make you into a knife. I want to have a point. That was clever wordplay. I recommend Amanda the Jedi's video for an actual detailed analysis, and I think I'm just going to say that the music was surprisingly good, the costumes were extravagant and quite beautiful, and the actresses really gave it their all. I think at least a couple of my notes said that somebody really looks like they should have an exorcism performed on them. Anne Hathaway could apparently make a pretty decent pop star. I think she needed some light sticks. But I did kind of got annoyed by her looking sicker and paler by the minute throughout the whole movie, and her basically having this face perpetually of like almost crying but never actually crying, eyes full of tears. I don't know. By the end of the film, it kind of got really repetitive. The dance was something else, though. Spooky action indeed. Demons were really leaving her soul during that one. And she was actually planning to sing while she was doing it? Uh huh. Yeah, sure. Sell me a couple more bridges, why don't you? I do not really feel like going deep into this one. 6 out of 10. It was good for the spectacle and the music, the atmosphere, and the ambiance. But what that whole thing was, I could not really explain. And with that, I hope you all have a great week. Now I gotta go take a cat nap. Bye! Meow.